Hello Synchronauts! I'm here today to talk to you about Synchronet version 3.19. Just released a week ago, January 2nd, 2022. And there is a document that describes all the changes, or at least the notable changes, that have gone into this version since version 3.18, which was released in September of 2020. This is a rather long list. I'll kind of be walking through most of these changes, not exactly in this order, but I also wanted to first, I guess, talk a little bit about the statistics of the release. It's about 15 months worth of development, on and off. Obviously, it's just a hobby. So from October of 2020 through December of 2021. The statistics are a little bit misleading, but between these two versions, 3.18 and 3.19, 2,276 files were changed. There were 326,000 insertions, so new lines or modifications, and 187,000 deletions, or deleted lines. And most of that is probably when I removed versions 1 and 2 from the Git repo. I put them in a separate repo. They have their own repo for historic value in case anybody ever wants to build those. They can get just that source code from that little time capsule back in the early 90s. But they no longer exist in the main Synchronet Git repo. So that accounts for a lot of the deletions. As for the insertions, I also added some libraries, notably libarchive. That's probably a big number of these line changes are new files that came in as part of the libarchive integration. Lastly, version 3.19 first appeared in the Git repo in April of last year. So it's had a lot of changes. This is notably is when the new file base was introduced. The development actually began before the last release, before 3.18. I had a sort of private branch I was working on and could not really get merged effectively until we switched to Git. That was one of the big reasons to switch to Git. So truth be told, the new file base has actually been in development for quite a while. It's leveraging the message base, SMB, Synchronet message base format. So there's a lot of reuse of that code, and it's a lot of reasons why it's been pretty successful and hasn't had a lot of issues since it was integrated. So it was an idea that was a long time coming. It's, I think, been percolating about for a long time. The idea of using SMB for the new file base, and I think I started that development probably in 2018, 2019, I don't recall, but it finally landed in Git in April. So and then there's been other changes since then, and so the mostly Linux community have been using the new file base for longer than most of the Windows users. Windows sysops have had access to the development builds, the nightlies, even since that time, but Windows sysops are typically a little less likely to upgrade to a development build and kind of go release to release. So that's why I think there's more Windows BBSs that are still on version 3.18. A little bit about the new file base. There is a whole document that talks about the new file base as well. This document, if you care to read and know all the details, covers the changes. The biggest one that most people will notice is long file names. We have had sort of hacks to support long file names in the Windows builds of Synchronet for ages, but it was, again, kind of a hack. We were still storing the Microsoft shortened file name. That's where you see the tilde number in the file name, and dynamically converting to the long file name for display purposes or whatnot. Now we don't do that. We don't store the shortened file name at all, and it's cross-platform, so you get long file name support regardless of the OS, as you would have from the beginning if you had designed this when long file names were a thing. But it was designed in about 1990 when we were definitely still using the old 8.3 formatted file names everywhere, or at least in DOS BBS land. So if you're logging in with an 80 by 25 terminal, you kind of limited in with listings like how long of a file name can you actually see. So there is an algorithm for sort of shortening the file names for display purposes. Yeah, that sounds pretty cool. Can you hear that? Can you hear the drums? So like syncterm.exe here, for example, the actual file name is syncterm-1.1-setup.exe, obviously a long file name, but it only displays in an 80 by 25 terminal as looking like that. But if you log in with a wide terminal, we can display more of the file name. So now you see you get more of the long file name here, because we have a wider terminal, and these single line descriptions are limited in width anyway. Then we can use more of the screen real estate for the file name. The first 64 characters of the file name are really the ones that are indexed in most available sets. If you're looking for a limitation, how long can the file names be? 64 characters is the reasonable limit. You can actually go much longer than that, but only 64 of those characters will be indexed. So if you're like searching for a portion of the file name, it'll only find it if it's in either the first 64 characters, the combination of that, and the extension of the file name. Now you'll notice here that the file names are actually like exactly the width necessary, and the extensions are out here, you know, padded, right justified. And if you go to a directory with shorter file names, then you'll see different. You know, so now we don't need as much space for the file names, and all that's built in to the logic in the source code, in the C++ source code. One huge change now is that all the file-based stuff is exposed in JavaScript. So it's very feasible and likely that file-based stuff will be rewritten in JavaScript, either by myself or other people. You know, they'll just have another interface to listing and adding files, you know, for the terminal server or web or whatever, and they can do all that all in JavaScript now. So previously, we weren't really exposing the file base via JavaScript. There were some third-party JavaScript libraries that could kind of do that, but you know, it wasn't really actively supported, and it wasn't, you know, full-featured. Looking for a good example of the new support for ANSI file descriptions. Previously, extended descriptions were limited to, I think, 512 characters. Now you can have up to 4,000 characters, and ANSI is converted to Control-A sequences on import, so you'll get, you know, colored descriptions if they exist. There's some good color ones. I think they are from the Blocktronics. Wow, got a lot of art packs in here. Jeez. And this is all new capability. You couldn't do this previously. You know, you get right justified in your listings. That's pretty cool looking cassette tape. And being that it's not storing ANSI, it's storing as Control-A, it'll actually expand correctly even for non-ANSI terminals. So like a Petsky terminal will see these, at least the colors and an approximation of the same block characters accurately. Yeah, that one, see how it's kind of cut off on the right? They made a super wide description there, so you get the full one if you do the extended information. All right, so you get the idea there. Also, with every file, there's more metadata now, so we store the CRC32 of the file contents, the MD5 sum, the SHA-1 hash, and these can be used to ensure that the file didn't change. So, like you'll notice if you go to the Synchronet download page, these three different forms of checksum are taken in real time out of the database for this file. So you can compare the file you download to the original and make sure that, you know, nothing was corrupted in flight, or if you got the file from another source and you want to make sure it matches the original, these are the actual checksum values. Let me see, we also import metadata from the source information. So if a file has source, and that is metadata that's appended to normally an ANSI file, but in this case it would be the DIZ file. That's the source of most of these extended descriptions you see here. So if a file has source, then you'll get an author and a group possibly, and those will be imported as well. Let me see if I can find one with, there we go. So author is Mista, Dizzyman, and the group is Blur. And this is coming out of the metadata in the DIZ file in the archive. Now, a lot of them now use fileid.ans instead of DIZ, and that's also imported, and that's where we'll also get the source information if it's available. And this all gets imported into the file base. Doesn't have to go and retrieve it from the file later. If the file contents change for some reason, then it won't display the checksum values here, the CRC, MD5, and SHA. It'll know if like the date's different or the size is different. It's not going to bother trying to show the checksum. It means somebody probably, the sysop, intentionally touched those files and updated it. And there is ways to update these values in the database if the file's modified later, but it doesn't do it automatically. You could maybe make a timed event or something if you wanted to have a process that went through and updated all your checksums regularly. But these are also handy for finding duplicate files. And so when uploading, for example, and you want to search for duplicates, or you just want to dedupe your file base as a sysop, we have some utility that's available. There always was a dupe find utility, but now it's even better, and it's a JavaScript module. But it'll find duplicate file names and duplicate contents depending on what you want to do. So larger files are now better supported. Typically, you want to stay below 2 gigs just because of issues with a lot of the download clients, but at least for the file base, file sizes up to 4 gigs are not a problem. File sizes bigger than that can be referenced in the database, but you'll have problems. You won't be able to download the Z-modem, and we don't try to compute checksums of files bigger than 4 gigs because that would take quite a while. So there are some technical limitations if you go beyond 4 gigs, but it is still possible. But when you install the upgrade pack, normally you're always encouraged to run JS exec update, and that will automatically run the upgrade utility for upgrading your old file bases to the new format. So that's included and it's pretty much automatic, but it's a one-time migration. And if you ever want to go back to the older version, you can still have the data files. You can still use that, but it won't be updating both sets of data files. So you pretty much, if you want to, upgrade to version 3.19, I certainly recommend it. You probably don't want to downgrade later, or you might have files that aren't represented in your databases. Okay, so you're probably familiar with the add files utility, the file list utility, the del files utility, and the dupe find utility. They've all been updated to support the new file base, but they are also being deprecated. I have JavaScript modules that perform these same functions, and they're going to do a better job, and they're going to be more easily extensible or modifiable. And generally, if you have something that's like automating using add files or file list, I'm encouraging you now to switch to using these JavaScript modules. And they have very similar command line syntax and functionality, but at some point probably stop supporting these old utilities. And if you want to see what that looks like when you run those, so for example, rather than using add files, which has that syntax, you would use JSExec add files. And it is a little bit different if you run it without any command line parameters. It asks you for the file area you want to add into. I think it probably has a -help option. And so this is the new syntax for the new add files JavaScript module compared to the old native program. One important difference: if you want to just add a single file, then use post file. It was much simpler to have add files, read directories or files.bbs listing files. And if you just want to add a single file, then post file has a slightly different syntax. Yeah, just dir code file name, file description, and uploader name. The new file base has much better performance. You'll notice, especially with the FTP server, when listing files or generating like the 00 index file, it's much quicker, which now expands the practical size of a file directory in Synchronet to many more thousands of files. So previously, I think there was like something like a 5,000 file limit, just kind of hard-coded, and that's now been removed. So you could go to tens of thousands of files. One important change, you probably recall the FTP server used to generate HTML file listings, and due to most browsers not supporting FTP anymore, and certainly not supporting the rendering of FTP files or HTML files served over FTP, we removed that support. It just didn't make sense to try to migrate all that to support the new file base when it really was a feature that nobody could make use of anyway. This is a pretty important feature, this libarchive integration. It's not really tied to the new file base, but it made sense to bring this in at the same time just because shelling out to run external archive utilities and doing that in a general same unified manner across all utilities and servers and services was more problematic. I mean, it's still kind of supported, but it's much better if you can just extract the archives internally in the same process. So this was a great thing to integrate. So for extracting and creating, we support zip, 7-zip, gzip-tar, and bzip-tar. Now, the bzip-tar is, I think, actually removed because it was problematic on Windows, but if you're interested in that support, let me know. I can make that configurable or enable it only for the Unix-like OSs. But for viewing archives, you can view RARs, LH, LZH, ISO, XR, and CAB. So it's quite a selection. It's not the super old file formats like ARC and ZOO, but PKPAC. We still support shelling out to external utilities. So if you really want to deal with the older archive formats using external utilities, you can do that if you like. Some other things we deprecated in this upgrade was alternative file paths. That was a way to have a single virtual directory on the BBS represent files from multiple physical directories, and you can do that with symlinks and other methods in modern file systems and OSs, so we just took that feature out. It was a very kind of clumsy solution anyway. Another was bidirectional file transfers. While this was great in the early 90s, you could send and receive files at the same time and even sometimes chat and play games using special features of the file transfer utilities. Those utilities have not been updated to modern times, so nobody's really using bimodem and HSLink and these bidirectional file transfer protocols, and it just didn't make sense to try to maintain that support in the BBS. So bye modem. Nice knowing you. Again, if you want more details, this is the wiki page to go to. So we'll move on to other features. I think the other pretty major and important feature for Windows sysops is that we now support something called NTVDM x64. The server I'm connected to is running on a 64-bit edition of Windows 10, and I do have some 16-bit DOS door games here, and like Global War, for example, and Trade Wars 2002, and it just runs. Look at that. It's kind of a long story about how that support got integrated, but it's basically helped by the leakage of the Windows source code from, I think, Windows NT and then Windows XP or Windows Server 2000 or something. That allowed somebody to take the sort of soft MS-DOS 16-bit support for non-Intel processors and then make that work on an Intel processor or AMD, Intel instruction set. So it's, while maybe not quite as fast as, NTVDM running on, the virtual 86 mode of a 32-bit or a processor in 32-bit mode. So may not be quite as fast. It's plenty fast. I mean, you can't tell the difference. It runs great. So this is totally awesome. As far as I'm concerned, incredible addition. Now people aren't stuck with 32-bit operating systems, Windows versions. They can run their 16-bit BBS utilities and door games on 64-bit editions of Windows. A couple notes here. The version of NTVDM that makes up this NTVDM x64 is older than the version that Microsoft is putting out now. So one little quirk there is that the newer NTVDMs require that things like virtual device drivers have to be located in the System32 directory. And the Synchronet virtual UART fossil driver, sbbs exec.dll, that's what it is. It's a virtual device driver. So after Windows Vista, you would have to put that in your System32 directory. But being that NTVDM x64 is based on an older version of NTVDM, then it will still pull it out of your exec directory. So the easiest solution there is just have your sbbs exec.dll, whatever version of Synchronet you're using, whatever version of Windows you're using, have it both in your exec directory and your Windows System32 directory, and you'll be all good. It'll just work. There might be some other differences in behavior. I noticed there's that I was using in my command prompt, escape open !P. I think it resets the terminal to known configuration or something, and that's not supported in this older NTVDM. Maybe they'll enhance it, maybe they'll bring it up to spec. Hey, maybe Microsoft will take it over and support this. I think it would be awesome if they did. Granted, there's always concerns about supporting all this legacy programs and the extra code required to do that, and security issues and reliability issues, but so far from what I'm seeing, it's as reliable as NTVDM is on a 32-bit OS. So very cool. Here's the web page for this project. There's a lot of instructions here. It's actually not as complicated as it sounds. You basically you need to download this archive linked to from here. It's a 7-zip file. It'll include a directory for your OS in language, and I think in my case, it was US English, or the US English version of Windows. Anyway, and then you find the install.bat file in that directory, you right click on it, you say run as administrator, and it installs. And I didn't have any issues. I think there maybe were some warnings about potential virus or whatever, but I excluded it. I know it's a false positive, so it worked fine. This next change here, we're talking about the loading and keeping each node's configuration in memory. What you'll notice is that if you make some change, say in SCFG, previously you'd have to wait for all nodes to become inactive, and then the control panel would reload that server, the configuration into that server's memory. Now that doesn't have to happen. Instead, when you connect, if you see loading configuration, right, that means it's loading a new configuration. So nothing actually has to recycle, really. It's kind of like doing it dynamic when it loads. Now you still have to log off if you make a change. But you see how it loaded configuration there? It said loading configuration. So you don't actually have to wait for it to recycle. That's just something that the server can do, so that the server code itself, if it needs to know the new configuration, it can. But the nodes are have their own copy of the configuration, and they will reload it dynamically as needed. So if you're messing around with door game configuration, for example, all you gotta do is log out and log back in, and there's no waiting for something to happen or waiting for other people to log off. You don't have to do that. There's a little bit more flexibility around the fossil configuration. You can have doors where you're saying it's UART only, and even if the door wants to use a fossil, it won't find one, because you can disable that if you like. Or likewise with the UART, you don't have to mess around with an INI file either to do that. The birth date format is now changed, so you get a full 4-digit year, both on input and in the storage format. There's no upgrade process required for that, it's just sort of automatic. We now have a lot more flexibility with the gender of users. It's not just a single character, M or F. It can be whatever characters you like. As a sysop, you can come up with your own gender and identifiers. But I made the standard M, F, and X. I was told that X is a well-known third option for gender where male or female doesn't apply. So if you don't like that, you can change it to something else. So terminal widths can now be manually set, and they can be longer than 99 rows as well. So basically more flexibility with regards to terminal dimensions. There are a whole lot of new at codes. Some of them are related to new file-based stuff, but yeah, mainly I'd say really the big one is this exclamation mark and then a letter. And that allows you to invoke a Control-A code character equivalent using an at code. So in some places you can't conceivably, it's not easy to use Control-A characters if you're like using an editor where it's not easy to put in, say Pablo Draw, for example, but you want to do something that's already supported with a Control-A code, then you can do it with this exclamation character. So if you want to do, say, a Control-A P, then instead you would do at exclamation P at, and that would be the equivalent. A lot more flexibility with date, time, display, and birth date stuff. Waiting for key presses and durations, there's more at code stuff there. A lot more text.dat strings. Really that was, in some cases, just for the new file-based support, or it was to add more flexibility, remove some more hard-coded strings that were identified by sysops. Okay, this is a pretty cool feature here. This is a third-party installer. So Michael Long helped me with this one, and he's actually responsible for most of the INI files in this directory. So how this works is if you have a door game that you want to install, rather than having a document in the wiki that says how to install it, I mean those are helpful, but they still require that you're looking at that, cross-referencing the setup program for the door or SCFG settings. Instead, you basically install the door into the extern directory, and you run this script, install extern, but you can also do it from here in the control panel. So you do run, install external programs. It's going to search and look for any door games that were installed that it knows how to configure in SCFG for you. And if they weren't previously installed, it'll ask you if you want to do it. So pretty cool feature. A lot of door games do have you have to run an install program or do some kind of additional setup for it, and that's still probably required in some cases. You'll have to still go through that step, but at least the Synchronet specific part, the SCFG settings, can be handled automatically for you. And that's what this option here is. But you can also do it with JSExec. Okay, this one's kind of cool. Is before there was a hard-coded setup for what makes a valid file name for upload by users, and now the sysop has more control over that. So under file options, allowed file name characters, you can specify the safest subset is just these characters. So capital A and lowercase a through Z, 0 through 9, dash, underscore, and dot. If you're worried about security or anything, that would be the safest subset to allow. If you then add the space character and other, some other ASCII characters, then you kind of go to that next level. You can include or exclude spaces. There's a help page here for explaining all these options, but basically sysop has control now over what characters are allowed in uploaded file names by, uploaded by users. So SBBS Echo also has some updates. One of the big new features is log rotation, so it's built in. You can specify max log size and the number of logs to keep, so you won't just continually fill your disk forever. It'll actually delete files, log files, and you can specify what size you'd like them to be. The control panel for Windows, which I've shown a couple times already. So I think one of the big changes here is the sound support. There's a lot more sounds added, so I think some sysops wanted to have different control over answer versus login. So that might be true for all servers. So there's common servers, so you have connect, and then you have login. You can have different sounds for those. You can have a separate sound for once a user is actually authenticated and allowed to log into the system. Okay, mail server has a few additional optional sound files as well, in addition to the common ones that apply to all the services. Receive, sending, and POP3 login. They can all have their unique sounds. Oh, one quick comment here. If you have NTVDM x64 installed, make sure you have this DOS program support enabled. Otherwise, the BBS is going to think that your system doesn't support 16-bit DOS programs. It's going to display an error rather than trying to run them. I'd like to point out is that more of the servers now support these maximum concurrent connections. It's something we've had in the terminal server for a while. Basically, the maximum number of concurrent connections from the same IP address. is what this means. So now if somebody logs in, then that connection isn't counted. This is only for the sort of non-logged in, non-authenticated or unauthenticated connections. But we have this similar setting now for the FTP server, maximum concurrent connections. And I think the mail server as well. Yeah, it also has it. We don't use this in the web server just because most browsers typically open, a lot of connections. So a single user using a single browser from a single IP address would typically have multiple HTTP sessions. So that setting really just doesn't make sense in this for the web server. All right, I think that about covers it. A lot of work went into the release. There's actually a lot of work going on for the next release already. I don't think that will be another 1.9 or 3.19 version. It'll probably be like a 3.20 or something, but there already been some minor fixes since 3.19, so if you want to run 3.19c, which is the current development build, you do have that available as well. I would encourage you to upgrade first to 3.19b. That's the official release version, and then apply the nightly update that you see fit. And most of, like I said, the Unix-like sysops, the Linux and FreeBSD sysops, they typically just update to whatever's the latest whenever they feel like it and get all the new features more readily than the Windows sysop. So maybe you guys want to stay current a little bit more, and you can do that with the nightly builds. You don't have to build the code yourself. All right, I think that covers everything. Keep an eye out for new developments, new features, definitely more on the horizon. Deuce has been doing some work behind the scenes, and that'll be really cool. So thank you to Cyan and eChicken and Deuce and all the other contributors that either added JavaScript code or given feature requests or test results. Appreciate all that. So thank you. Happy New Year. Stay healthy, everybody. And talk to you later.